Alright, what's up guys? So in today's course, we will be discussing the fundamentals of building muscle. This is a step-by-step guide for beginners. This course is particularly for those who are new to lifting weights, who have never really stepped foot in the gym. However, if you are in the intermediate stages, meaning if you've been training for anywhere from 6 to 12 months, it is possible that you will gain some insights from this, but it is primarily for those who want to get started in the gym but have no idea how to go about putting on muscle mass or gaining weight. So the contents of this course, in it we will be discussing the fundamentals of how to gain weight and how to lose weight. So we'll talk about what exactly goes into gaining weight and losing weight. We'll look at one of the most fundamental and effective tools that you can use for gaining and losing weight. We will be discussing how to accurately determine your maintenance weight, which is extremely important because your maintenance weight is your maintenance calories is what determines how much you need to eat, how many calories you need to eat, how much food you need to eat in order to either lose weight or gain weight. All right, we'll be discussing how much muscle can you put on as someone who is a natural lifter, and by natural I mean someone who doesn't take supplements such as anabolic steroids, because I remember in my beginning stages, I thought I was going to be as big as John Cena, as Ronnie Coleman, as Triple H. I thought I was going to be as big as some of these WWE superstars, some of these professional IFBB pro bodybuilders. But after about a year in, I realized, oh, okay, as a natural, there's a threshold, and there's actually a certain amount of muscle you can put on. All right, we'll discuss how to eat in a caloric surplus. We'll talk about eating in adequate amounts of protein. We'll talk about what types of food you should and need to eat in order to build muscle. And we'll talk about common problems that occur when you're bulking. And we'll talk about the different types of bulking, which include clean bulking and dirty bulking. All right, so the fundamentals of weight gain and weight loss. All right, so in order to gain weight, you have to eat above your maintenance calories. In order to lose weight, you must eat below your maintenance calories. So let's look at this graphic right here. Let's say your maintenance is 2,000 calories a day. If you're a guy, your maintenance calories are going to be substantially higher than 2,000 calories a day, most likely, unless you don't move. But let's just say that let's just say you use the TDEE calculator, which we will look at here shortly, and it was determined that your maintenance calories was 2,000 calories per day. All right, so anything above 2,000 calories you eat is a caloric surplus, which means you will be gaining weight for that day. Anything below 2,000 calories a day is a caloric deficit, which means you will be losing weight for that day. Now, it should be noted that while you can't really, for beginners, you can't really gain muscle unless you're in a caloric surplus. However, you technically can gain muscle when you're either maintaining weight or on a very small caloric deficit, if you're in a very small cut, if your protein is high enough, and if your training is adequate enough. But as a beginner, it's likely that you probably won't know how to train properly. You most likely won't have an adequate understanding of mind-muscle connection. So I highly suggest that beginners should eat in a caloric surplus when starting out so they can gain muscle as quickly as possible. Now we will be looking at the TDEE calculator. So we're going to click on this link. Now I will also say you can find this exact calculator by literally Googling TDEE calculator. Clicking on this, you can find it that way too. So here we are, TDEE calculator. All right, so you enter the information. I live in the United States, so I'm going to use imperial units. However, if you live anywhere else other than the United States, I know a lot of you guys are in Europe. You enter, metric information, or you enter your information in metric units. All right, so I'm 27. Right now, I weigh about 170 pounds. I am 5'10". You enter your height. Now I'm at your activity level. Now we're gonna go into further detail about your activity level later, but for now, I'm gonna put heavy exercise. Body fat, 10%, probably lower, but we'll say 10%. And so your body fat, when you're entering this, you want to take your best estimate. I highly recommend you Google body fat percentage image photographs so you have an idea as to what yours is. So if we just Google body fat percentage pictures, this is a pretty good one actually. Right, it's like I'm really here somewhere between 8 and 10, but yeah, I'd highly recommend you use this to get an idea, enter that. So we're going to go back to the TDE calculator. We're going to calculate. All right, so my maintenance calories is 3,224 calories a day. That means in order for me to maintain my body weight, I need to eat that many calories per day. As I said earlier in the last slide, if I eat below it, I'll lose weight. If I eat above it, I'll gain weight. So one thing to note, that in order to consistently gain weight, you need to be in a, I like to measure things relative to a week. So like if you want to gain weight, you need to be in a caloric surplus for that week. So let's say I eat in a caloric surplus of 500 calories 3 days a week, but I eat in a caloric deficit of 500 calories the remaining 4 days a week. That means I'll be in a deficit of 500 calories that week, which means even though I ate in a surplus for 3 days that week, I'll still have lost weight overall that week. So make sure when you're bulking or eating in a caloric surplus or eating in a caloric deficit that you are setting your goals and measuring them relative to the week and not the day. All right. All right, so now we'll talk about activity level, finding your maintenance calories. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the hardest aspect of adequately calculating your maintenance calories is determining your activity level. And of course, like your activity level is kind of hard to accurately determine because it can vary a lot day by day. Now, here's a really interesting thing about your activity level or finding your maintenance calories via activity level. It's primarily dependent on the amount of steps you take in a day. So, what does that mean? It means, let's say you have a sedentary job. Let's say you work 9 to 5 and you work at a desk and you sit at a desk job. Or excuse me, you have a desk job and you sit most of your day. Okay? So let's say you take like 3,000 steps at work from 9 to 5. And then you go and you lift weights for an hour and a half. Even though you lifted heavy weights for that hour and a half, because you took so little steps, your activity level, unless you were really, really killing it in that hour and a half of just lifting weights, is most likely lightly active. So, it really takes trial and error to accurately determine what your activity level is. But what I will say is your options are sedentary, lightly active, active, and highly active. Okay, obviously, if you lift weights and run like 9,000, like if you were to lift weights for an hour and take 9,000 steps, you'd obviously be boosted from the lightly active to active category, okay? But a good rule of thumb is, if you take anywhere between under 1,000 steps a day, you're sedentary. Between 1,000 to 10,000 steps a day, you're lightly active. If you do 10 to 23,000 steps a day, you're active. and anything over 23,000 steps is highly active. And I'd say anything over 30,000 steps a day would put you in the athlete category. Again, it's a rule of thumb, right? Because an athlete can train for 45 minutes, but if that athlete is exerting himself 100% all out during that 45 minutes, he's obviously going to be, his activity level is going to be higher than highly active. He'll be elevated to the athlete category. So again, like I said, it takes a considerable amount of trial and error. But a good rule of thumb is, these steps. Furthermore, if you guys are any runners or you like running, you burn approximately a minimum of 100 calories per mile every time you run. And you can approximately walk, like the average person walks about 2,000 steps in 1 mile. However, I will say that running 1 mile is equivalent to taking about 3,000 steps. So if you run 5 miles, right, your activity level is already at in between. It's already at active and almost at highly active. So if you were to lift for an hour and then run 5 miles, you'd probably be pushed into the highly active category. So again, what you want to do is you want to take your best guess at what your activity level is, enter all that information into your TDEE calculator, and determine via trial and error what it is. So let's say you determine that you're active, right? And let's say your maintenance is 3,000. And let's say you eat 3,500 calories a day. All right, because a caloric surplus of 500 calories is equivalent to gaining 1 pound of weight a week. So let's say you eat 3,500 calories a day, and let's say you measure your results over the course of 2 weeks. In theory, you should be gaining about 2 pounds. But let's say you lose weight eating 3,500 calories a day, or you maintain weight eating 3,500 calories a day, in spite of eating adequate protein and being in a caloric surplus. That means your activity level of active should actually be higher. You should actually be in the highly active or athlete category. So again, my advice for you when determining maintenance calories, this is where a lot of people struggle, because a lot of people have no problem eating protein, and a lot of people have no problem going to the gym and eating weights or lifting weights. The hard part for most people is consistently being in a caloric surplus. I will say this again. If you are a beginner, you will not gain muscle whatsoever unless you are eating in a caloric surplus. This is very important. So take your best stab at determining what your maintenance calories are. Eat above that, measure your results for 2 weeks, and modify if necessary. This is very important. All right. So now we will be discussing how much muscle you can gain as a natural. All right. So, like I said earlier, I remember being a beginner and thinking to myself, I'm going to be as big as Arnold Schwarzenegger. Oh, I'm going to be as big as Ronnie Coleman, John Cena. And I have buddies tell me, yeah, those guys are on steroids. No, they're not on steroids. I think they're natural. Boy, was I wrong. Okay. So that begs the question, how much muscle can you gain as a natural? Because there's lots of people who go around proclaiming to be naturals when they're actually fake naturals. Now, I will say, the amount you can build depends on your genetics and the frame you have. So like me, I have like a small frame, so I can't put on that much muscle. I mean, I'm a pretty big guy, but I will never be able to put on as much muscle as someone who has a larger, more wide frame, right? And the best predictors of how much muscle you can gain as a natural lifter are the circumference of your wrists and ankles. All right, so the size of your wrists and ankles. The larger your wrists and ankles, the more muscle you can put on, you can develop. The smaller your wrists and ankles, the less muscle you can build. Moreover, the amount of muscle you can build after 1 to 2 years of adequate training, and I won't go into details about what exactly constitutes adequate training in this video or in this course rather, because it is not in the scope, and understanding how to train properly requires its own course. And it takes a considerable amount of time and effort. But it will decrease considerably after 1 to 2 years of proper training. At first, when you're a beginner, I tell people that the amount of muscle they can expect to build, assuming they're eating in a caloric surplus and eating adequate amounts of protein, is 1 pound of muscle per month. Like, technically, it says right here, according to these guidelines, that you can put on 2 pounds of muscle per month, and that's absolutely correct. However, it's not taking into account how unlikely that will be for a beginner, because again, it takes into account proper training with really good genetics. All right. So 2 pounds is the most you can put on with really good genetics, unless you have like superior genetics. Like, just think about some like freak in the NFL or some freak wrestler or some freak NBA athlete. But you're most likely not a freak athlete, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, how it is. So if you look here at this muscle maximum, or this maximum muscle potential calculator, I'll use this one to determine the maximum amount of muscle you can build naturally. What I literally Googled max muscle potential calculator and scrolled all the way down to the one that says the Casey Butt calculator. Now, again, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but I found it to be, and other people have found it to be, pretty accurate. So, again, ultimately, the only way to determine how much muscle you can build naturally is by lifting weights and figuring out for yourself over time. So let's look at some examples of natural bodybuilders, people who claim to be natural bodybuilders but aren't, and guys who are on steroids. So we'll look at some examples of natural bodybuilders. All right, here we've got Luke Hopkins. He's a professional natural bodybuilder. I'm trying to find pictures of him at a show. Here we go. So he's a bodybuilding. Yeah, like this guy. Yeah, this guy's natural. You can tell he's a natural just because he looks great. He has a lot of muscle, but he doesn't have that much muscle mass, right? Like, he's a big dude, but he's not huge, right? Like, you wouldn't look at him and think, oh, steroids. So you can tell that someone's natural because when they're super shredded, they'll look fit, right? You won't think of them as huge. You'll think of them as really, really fit, okay? Like, when you look at this guy, you don't think, oh, damn, this dude's massive. He looks great, but you don't think, oh, this dude looks massive. You think, oh, this guy looks really, really fit. And that's the number one indicator that someone is natural. All right, here's another example. We got this guy. He's also a former professional natural classic bodybuilder. Again, you look at this guy, you think, oh, he's a pretty big dude, but he doesn't look massive, right? He looks really fit. You see, he doesn't look massive, looks really fit. All right, here's a good one. Jeff Nippard. So the leaner you are as a natural, the more fit you will look. It's possible to become massive as a natural. However, you will not. You can't be lean and massive as a natural. That's the number one giveaway. All right. So now we'll look at some people who are fake naturals, meaning they claim to be natural, but they're really not. Jeff Side, first and foremost. Yeah, you see how this guy's shredded, but he has a ton of muscle mass? That's how you know that he is on steroids. He claims to be natural, but he's not. All right, so more. Here we go. Yeah, see, really lean, but tons of muscle mass. The more lean you are, like that for example, the more lean you are as a natural. That's a sick. He looks amazing here, but the more lean you are as a natural, the more muscle you will lose. All right. Connor Murphy, he's a good one. Yeah, so this is Connor Murphy before he fell off. Yeah, just any Connor Murphy video. From this, for example, anyone before he fell off. Now let's look at some fake naturals. John Cena. Yeah, he just has way too much muscle mass at his leanness. Way too much muscle mass at his leanness. This is a good photo. Way too much muscle mass at his leanness. I used to think I could become like that as a natural. Now we'll look at The Rock. I mean, this is just self-explanatory. Way too much muscle mass at his leanness. But you get the point. All right, so we're moving on. All right, so what foods do you need in order to build muscle? Okay, so in order to build muscle, here we go. How to build muscle. Well, I knew I skipped a slide. So we'll look at this first. How to build muscle. So if you're a beginner, you must, like I said earlier, you must eat in a caloric surplus in order to build muscle. Now, in addition to eating muscle, you have to eat protein. Protein is the macronutrient that allows your body to build muscle. Now, whenever you're building muscle, you want to eat between 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Anything over 0.8 to 1 grams of protein per pound of body weight is excess, and anything under 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per body weight is too little. So a good rule of thumb is eat 0.8 to 1 gram of protein of body weight per day. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you should be eating a minimum of 160 grams of protein to gain weight, and attempting to not exceed 200 grams of protein, because if you eat too much protein, you'll notice you'll have like the protein farts, and you'll be farting all day, and everything you poop out will just be excess protein. So a solution to getting protein that a lot of people like are protein bars and protein shakes. And while those are adequate means of building muscle, nothing is as effective and beneficial for you as eating actual real meat. So and we'll discuss what foods these are specifically, but I highly recommend that you avoid protein bars and protein shakes at all costs when building muscle, because meat is superior to all of those. Now, if you're a beginner, I highly recommend that you eat in a caloric surplus of 250 calories per day. A caloric surplus of 250 calories a day over the course of assuming 7 days a week, that's gaining 2 pounds of weight per month. You could eat more than this. However, you don't want to put on too much fat, right? Because as a beginner, assuming you're doing everything right, assuming proper training, you can put on at most, assuming normal genetics, 2 pounds of muscle per month. However, again, like I said, you're a beginner, and so you're not going to have proper training. So you're going to put on, it is my opinion that you won't put on more than 1 pound of muscle per month. As such, I highly recommend eating in a surplus of 250 calories a day, because that'll result in you only putting on 2 pounds that month, one of which being muscle, the other half being fat, water, and carbs. Now, if you eat in a certain surplus daily, but you're gaining more weight, that means two things. It means you're gaining excess weight from carbs and water and glycogen, or your surplus is actually too high and you're eating well above maintenance. So again, that's where the trial and error thing comes in again. So again, if you notice that you're eating in a specific surplus and you're getting more weight than you should probably either lower that surplus or determine if it's a surplus of weight from water, carbs, and glycogen. Now, the water, carbs, and glycogen excess weight usually subsides after the first 2 weeks. So like the amount of water and carbs you store, you should expect the weight you gain to stabilize after the first 2 weeks of bulking. Again, this isn't a weightlifting guide. However, in order to best gain weight, you want to focus on training consistently and progressive overload, which I will discuss in great detail in further courses. All right, moving on. All right, in this slide, we will be discussing what foods you want to eat to build muscle. So technically, you can eat anything you want as long as you don't exceed your daily caloric threshold and eat adequate amounts of protein. So let's say you have a daily caloric threshold of 3,500 calories, and you have to eat 200 grams of protein a day. And let's say you eat 2,000 calories and hit your 200 grams of protein goal at 2,000 calories. That means you have 1,500 calories left you need to eat in order to gain weight. Well, you can legitimately eat the extra 1,500 calories. You can eat whatever you want for those remaining 1,500 calories, and you won't gain too much excess fat other than what you would expect to, because it fits your macros and you hit your protein goal. So just keep that in mind. It might not be healthy to eat like 3 McDoubles from McDonald's to fill your final 1,500 calories, but that is an option. So one thing to note, most foods are high in protein and low in calories when you're eating lean meats. So lean meats typically have very high protein but are low calories. So like when you see bodybuilders eating chicken and rice, they're doing that because it has tons of protein at very low calories when they're getting ready for a show. However, when they're bulking, they typically eat, adequate amounts of protein and whatever they want for the remainder. So like one misconception there is that if you eat adequate amounts of protein, you'll grow regardless. However, if you eat adequate amounts of protein but don't eat enough calories, you still won't build muscle. You have to be in a caloric surplus to build muscle. Another problem people have is that they don't have a problem eating protein, but they struggle getting enough calories. Right? So like if you eat 200 grams of protein and 2,000 calories, but you're full, you're struggling eating food, I highly recommend eating calorie-dense food. Those are just like foods that are smaller portion but have high calories. All right, so first, let's look at the best foods to eat for protein. All right, so like I said earlier, when you're trying to build muscle, most foods high in protein are low in calories. These include chicken breast, chicken thighs, tuna, eggs. You can also eat egg whites, ground turkey. I recommend eating ground turkey 93.7 and above. Those are the best. Any forms of beef jerky, Greek yogurt, and beef liver. What all these foods have in common is that they're extremely high in protein, but rather low in calories. Like, all right, so we have high calorie proteins. You got the ground beef patties, and peanut butter. And just so let's say you have so those are the proteins you should be eating. Now let's say you have no problem eating adequate amounts of protein, but you do have difficulty getting calories. If that's the case, I highly recommend you eat peanut butter, bagels. I personally like bagels with peanut butter on them because one bagel has about 300 calories. You can add about 3 servings of peanut butter on one bagel. Right there, that's like 780 calories. Peanuts have lots of calories. A box of Pop-Tarts, that's 400 empty calories right there. Fast food is an option if you don't exceed, assuming it doesn't exceed your caloric threshold for the day. And muffins, hell, a large muffin has over 500 calories. So you really should not have a problem eating enough calories as long as you eat these calorie-dense foods. All right. So that is all I have for this course. And those are essentially the fundamentals of what goes in to building muscle. Now, in this course, of course, we did not detail exactly what you need to do, what exercises you need to do to build muscle. I will go into details about that in another course. However, after completion of this course, you should now have a better understanding of what you need to do in order to build muscle. Now, the main takeaways here are that you need to eat in a caloric surplus, eat adequate proteins, eat adequate amounts of protein. Understand that you can eat adequate amounts of protein, but that if you eat adequate amounts of protein but don't eat in a caloric surplus, you will not gain muscle. You need to determine your maintenance calories via a TDEE calculator. You want to eat above your maintenance calories that you found via that TDEE calculator. You want to determine your maintenance calories via trial and error and monitor your weight for 2 weeks to determine if the amount you're eating above your maintenance calories is yielding the results you desire. And understand that foods that are high in protein typically are low in calories, and that if you struggle eating enough calories, you should eat calorie-dense foods. All right, and that is all I have for this one, folks, and I will see you all in the next course.